Chapter 17, From Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 3, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 3, Chapter 17. Following the lead of South Carolina, the governor of Georgia began the secession movement in that state almost immediately after the presidential election by such public declarations and acts as fell within the scope of his personal influence and official authority. But Georgia had given a heavy vote for Douglas, and her people were imbued with a strong feeling of conditional unionism. An opposition to hasty secession at once developed itself of so formidable a character that all the influence and cunning of the secessionists were needed to push their movement to success. The ablest men in the state hurried to Milledgeville and met in a sort of battle royal of speech-making and wire-pulling. The legislature was the target, and its action or non-action upon military appropriations and a convention bill was the result to be effected. Senator Toombs and others made speeches to promote secession, and in reply to these, Alexander H. Stephens addressed the legislature by special invitation on the 14th of November. His speech takes rank as the ablest made by a Southerner in opposition to disunion. The occasion appears to have been one of great excitement. Toombs sat on the platform beside the speaker and interlarded the address with his cynical interrogatories and comments, which Stephens met in every instance with successful repartee. The speaker declared that to secede in consequence of Lincoln's election was to break the Constitution and show bad faith. "We went into the election with this people," said he. "The result was different from what we wished, but the election has been constitutionally held. Mr. Lincoln could do the South no harm against an adverse House and Senate. This government, with all its defects, came nearer the object of all good governments than any other on the face of the earth." One by one he refuted the charges and complaints which had been advanced by Toombs, and warned his hearers against the perils of sudden disunion. Liberty once lost might never be restored. Georgia had grown great, rich, and intelligent in the Union. "I look upon this country with our institutions as the Eden of the world, the paradise of the universe. It may be that out of it we may become greater and more prosperous, but I am candid and sincere in telling you that I fear if we yield to passion, and without sufficient cause shall take that step, instead of becoming greater or more peaceful, prosperous, and happy, instead of becoming gods, we will become demons, and at no distant day commence cutting one another's throats." The speech created an immense sensation throughout the South, and but for an artful trick of the secessionists would have arrested and changed the immediate tide of secession in Georgia. Seeing that the underlying Union feeling was about to endanger their scheme of revolt through defection or hesitation on the part of the Empire State of the South, they devised an adroit plea to appropriate its whole force to further their own plans. They persistently urged that we can make better terms out of the Union than in it. Mr. Stephens himself has explained the misrepresentation and its result. Two-thirds at least of those who voted for the ordinance of secession did so, I have but little doubt, with a view to a more certain reformation of the Union. To understand this statement more thoroughly, it must be added that Mr. Stephens's great Union speech was also enthusiastically hailed by the North as a sign of firm allegiance. But that part of the country totally misapprehended its spirit and object. With all of his eloquently asserted devotion to the Union, he was a pro-slavery man of the most ultra type. He defended the institution upon the higher law doctrine. "If slavery," said he, "as it exists with us is not best for the African, constituted and made as he is, if it does not best promote his welfare and happiness socially, morally, and politically, as well as that of his master, it ought to be abolished." He believed slavery should be protected in the territories by federal law. He did not go quite to the extent of advocating a revival of the African slave trade, but went so far as to suggest that without such a reopening, the South could not maintain her coveted balance of power. If the policy of this country, said he, settled in its early history of prohibiting further importations or immigrations of this class of population, is to be adhered to, the race of competition between us and our brethren of the North in the colonization of new states, which heretofore has been so well maintained by us, will soon have to be abandoned. So again, while he asserted that the South had lost nothing but gained much through the slavery agitation, and while he maintained that she was menaced by no danger, he had been for nearly 10 years a conditional disunionist. During the agitation of 1850, a convention of Georgia passed certain resolutions known as the Georgia Platform. The resolutions declared the acceptance of the Compromise of 1850 as a permanent adjustment, and then went on to threaten disunion in case that adjustment were violated. This Georgia Platform was Mr. Stevens's rallying ground and stronghold. Latterly, he had extended it by including personal liberty bills as a cause of disunion. He loved the Union, but he held the Union secondary to the Georgia Platform, and he opposed secession because he thought it a departure from this platform. Not only a departure from the Georgia Platform, said he, and from the long-established principles of the National Democratic Party, but an entire change of position of the entire South, of all parties, not of all individuals, in relation to the power and jurisdiction of the federal government over the subject of African slavery. When the disruption of the Charleston Convention paralyzed the Democratic Party, Mr. Stevens lost heart. He thought the times out of joint. He saw no further prospect of doing good. The popular fever must run its course. If disunion came, he avowed he would yield to the misfortune. His destiny, he said, lay with Georgia and the South. It will appear from this that Mr. Stevens was a most unsafe political mentor. Yet out of this lethargy of conviction and will came the splendid outburst of patriotic eloquence and Union argument of his Milledgeville speech, only to be marred, however, at its close by renewed adhesion to the Georgia Platform and a new subserviency to the will of Georgia. The newspapers brought the report of Mr. Stevens's speech to Springfield, the home of Mr. Lincoln, as well as to all other Northern cities, and the President-elect read its stirring periods with something of the general hope that a gleam of light was shining upon dark places. Like other men in the North, he had no means of knowing the eccentricities of Mr. Stevens's principles and policy, and therefore probably shared the general error of overvaluing his expressions of attachment to the Union. He had personally known him as a fellow congressman and a fellow Whig in 1847 through 49. They had become co-laborers in their advocacy of the nomination and election of General Taylor to the presidency, and through these associations contracted a warm social and political friendship. It was, therefore, most natural that, upon reading his reported speech, Mr. Lincoln addressed a note of a few lines to Mr. Stevens, asking him for a revised copy, and this note led to a short but most interesting correspondence. Mr. Stevens replied courteously, saying that his speech had not been revised by him, that while the newspaper report contained several verbal inaccuracies, its main points were sufficiently clear for all practical purposes. The note enclosed with the following sentence: "The country is certainly in great peril, and no man ever had heavier or greater responsibilities resting upon him than you have in the present momentous crisis." The phrase seemed to open the way to a confidential interchange of thought, and a few days afterwards Mr. Lincoln wrote the following frank letter: "For your own eye only, Springfield, Illinois, December 22nd, 1860. Honorable A. H. Stevens. My dear Sir, Your obliging answer to my short note is just received, and for which please accept my thanks. I fully appreciate the present peril the country is in and the weight of responsibility on me. Do the people of the South really entertain fears that a Republican administration would, directly or indirectly, interfere with the slaves or with them about the slaves? If they do, I wish to assure you, as once a friend and still, I hope, not an enemy, that there is no cause for such fears. The South will be in no more danger in this respect than it was in the days of Washington. I suppose, however, this does not meet the case. You think slavery is right and ought to be extended, while we think it is wrong and ought to be restricted. That, I suppose, is the rub. It certainly is the only substantial difference between us. Yours very truly, A. Lincoln. With equal frankness, Mr. Stevens, under date of December 30, wrote a long reply which is conspicuous for its candid admissions, premising that though differing from him politically, he was not Mr. Lincoln's enemy. Mr. Stevens proceeded as follows. I will also add that in my judgment the people of the South do not entertain any fears that a Republican administration, or at least the one about to be inaugurated, would attempt to interfere directly and immediately with slavery in the States. Their apprehension and disquietude do not spring from that source. They do not arise from the fact of the known anti-slavery opinions of the president-elect. Washington, Jefferson, and other presidents are generally admitted to have been anti-slavery in sentiment. But in those days, anti-slavery did not enter as an element into party organizations. But now this subject, which is confessedly on all sides outside of the constitutional action of the government, so far as the states are concerned, is made the central idea in the platform of principles announced by the triumphant party. The leading object seems to be simply and wantonly, if you please, to put the institutions of nearly half the states under the ban of public opinion and national condemnation. This, upon general principles, is quite enough of itself to arouse a spirit, not only of general indignation, but of revolt on the part of the proscribed. We at the South do think African slavery, as it exists with us, both morally and politically right. This opinion is founded upon the inferiority of the black race. You, however, and perhaps a majority of the North, think it wrong. Admit the difference of opinion. The same difference of opinion existed to a more general extent amongst those who formed the Constitution when it was made and adopted. The changes have been mainly to our side. As parties were not formed on this difference of opinion, then why should they be now? The same difference would, of course, exist in the supposed case of religion. When parties or combinations of men, therefore, so form themselves, must it not be assumed to arise not from reason or any sense of justice, but from fanaticism? The motive can spring from no other source, and when men come under the influence of fanaticism, there is no telling where their impulses or passions may drive them. This is what creates our discontent and apprehension. Conciliation and harmony, in my judgment, can never be established by force, nor can the Union under the Constitution be maintained by force. The Union was formed by the consent of independent sovereign states. Ultimate sovereignty still resides with them separately, which can be resumed and will be if their safety, tranquility, and security in their judgment require it. Under our system, as I view it, there is no rightful power in the general government to coerce a state in case any one of them should throw herself upon her reserved rights and resume the full exercise of her sovereign powers. Force may perpetuate a union, that depends upon the contingencies of war, but such a union would not be the union of the Constitution. It would be nothing short of a consolidated despotism. Mr. Lincoln could not, of course, enter upon a further discussion of the topics raised, and made no reply to Mr. Stevens's letter. The correspondence is noteworthy as showing how both writers agreed upon the actual and underlying cause of the political crisis, namely that the South believed slavery to be right and ought to be extended, while the North believed it was wrong and ought to be restricted. It was a conflict of opinion. Such conflicts have come in all times, in all nations, and under all forms of government. But admitting the existence of such a conflict of opinion, the legitimate inquiry arises, was it a proper cause of war? History must answer this question unhesitatingly and emphatically in the negative. In ages happily past, the anger of a king, the caprice of a mistress, or the ambition of a minister has often deluged a nation in blood. But in our day, the conscience of civilization demands that the sword shall only defend the life of governments and the life, liberty, and property of their subjects. It has ordained that written constitutions shall decide claims of rulers and rights of citizens. Casuistry, the most adroit, could not prove the right of the free states to expel the slave states for believing the institution of slavery to be a substantial blessing. Equally absurd was the doctrine that the slave states had a right to destroy the Union by secession because the free states thought slavery a moral, social, and political evil. Upon this question, as upon all others, public opinion was the arbiter appointed by the Constitution and laws. Upon this question, the lawful and constitutional verdict had been pronounced by the election of Lincoln, and the proper duty of the South under the circumstances had been admirably stated by Mr. Stephens himself in his Milledgeville speech. In my judgment, the election of no man constitutionally chosen to that high office is sufficient cause for any state to separate from the Union. It ought to stand by and still maintain the Constitution of the country. Mr. Stephens's letter ignored the existence of the pro-slavery sentiment in the South, which had for 6 years been united and unceasing in party affiliation and action, and that this party action had wrought the repeal of the Missouri Compromise in violation of plighted political faith and generous comity between sections. Moreover, that anti-slavery opinions had not only been under ban of public sentiment there, but had notoriously for years been visited with mob violence and been made the subject of prohibitory penal statutes. The experiment of a sentimental union, dreamed of by Stephens and others, had been fully tried in the Compromise of 1850 and first and flagrantly violated by the South herself against every appeal and protest. End of chapter 17.